On the 12th of January, 1888, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, children walked out of a schoolhouse in Dakota Territory, without their coats. The sun was warm, the sky was blue. It was the kind of winter day that feels like a mercy after weeks of cold. 90 minutes later, the temperature had dropped 40 degrees. The wind was moving so fast a grown man could not stand in it. The snow was not falling. It was arriving sideways, and it was arriving in a wall. By nightfall, that wall had killed more than 200 people across 4 territories. But in a hillside above the town of Rustcreek Hollow, in a cave that everyone had called worthless on a piece of land that had been given away as a death sentence disguised as charity, a fire was burning. The air inside was warm. The floor was warm. A sick woman was breathing without a cough for the first time in 2 years. And an 18-year-old girl was quietly preparing to open her door to the same neighbors who had watched her family thrown into the cold 5 months earlier. The men who had signed that deed thought they were burying 2 Norwegian widows. They did not know they had just handed over the richest ground in the valley. They did not know her father had already read it. And they did not know she had been listening. Cold in November, Dakota Territory. The town of Rustcreek Hollow had built itself out of prairie wind and the profits of a copper concern that had opened 5 years earlier and had made 3 men rich and killed 6. One of those 6 had been Anders Halvorsen, except no one had ever found him, which was the part Solveig thought about most often. In the small hours, when her mother slept, when the cabin was so quiet she could hear the frost do its work in the boards above her. Not the collapse, not the falling timber, not the rumor of black smoke coming up out of shaft number 3 8 months earlier, on a morning in March, when the ice was still thick on the water trough. The part she thought about was the hat. The hat had been returned to them on the 3rd day after the collapse, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, carried by a man from the company office who did not remove his own hat when he handed it over. He set it down on the table. He said the word regrets. He walked back to his wagon. The hat had smelled like her father. For 6 days, Sigrid Halvorsen had held it against her chest at night the way she had held infants. Then she had put it on the shelf above the stove, where it still sat, gathering dust in the crown, waiting for a man who was not coming back, because there had been no body, because in Rustcreek Hollow in the autumn of 1886, a woman without a husband and without a grave was a woman without a category, and a woman without a category was a woman without protection. The letter had arrived on the 9th of November. Cream envelope, thick paper, cane seal in green wax. Present yourselves at the town hall. Wednesday, 1 o'clock. The board would like to review your circumstances. Circumstances. Sigrid had read the word twice. Then she had folded the letter with the careful, over-neat motion of a woman who did not trust her hands. They are going to take it, she said. Solveig did not answer, because there was nothing to answer, because she had known since August, when Rutherford Kane had ridden past the cabin twice in 1 week without stopping, that this letter or one like it was coming. She had known the way a woman knows weather, not from any specific sign, from the accumulation of all of them. She had used the 4 months since to prepare. The town hall smelled of pine resin and old tobacco, and the particular staleness of a room in which men had been making decisions for other men's wives. 5 men behind a long table, 2 women standing in front of it. The distance between the 2 positions was not measured in feet. Rutherford Kane sat in the middle chair. He had the deliberate slowness of a man who understood that speaking slowly made his words sound weightier than they were. He had a watch chain that represented in isolation more than the Halvorsen family had owned in the last 2 years combined. His face was the color and texture of good beef, and when he looked at Sigrid, he did not use her married name. Sigrid, he said, not Mrs. Halvorsen, not the widow Halvorsen. Sigrid, stripped of the honorific a husband's name provides. Reduced to a first name the way a person reduces a thing they do not fully consider a person. Solveig felt it in her spine. She did not move, because moving was what they wanted, because moving was what a trembling girl did. And Solveig Halvorsen at 18 had learned early that the world reads trembling the way it reads blood in water. As invitation, "The board has reviewed your circumstances," Kane said. "With winter approaching, and your present situation, we cannot in good conscience allow you to remain in the cabin on company land." There it was. The cabin will be required for our incoming assayer. His eyes went past Sigrid, to the back of the room. Solveig followed the look. A young man in a new coat sat in the third row, hands folded in his lap, chin down. He did not look up. But when Kane said the word assayer, his shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly. The shift of a man hearing his own name spoken aloud in a room that had not addressed him. Wendell Kane, the judge's nephew, 24 years old, clean fingernails, no experience of frost. The cabin was not needed. The cabin was wanted. Those two words were the width of a life. The board, however, is not without generosity. He was gesturing at a map behind him now. The territory laid out in inked boundaries. His finger moved to the north. 3 acres, free and clear. Deeded to you today. He said it the way a man delivers a gift he expects to be thanked for. Solveig looked at the map. She knew the place. Everyone in the valley knew the place. They called it Cold Anvil Ridge. The north-facing slope of loose scree and stunted juniper that caught every cold wind the Black Hills could generate and gave nothing back. No timber worth cutting. No pasture worth grazing. No water except the violent snowmelt that carved new gullies each spring and vanished into rock before summer. Its only feature of any note was a fissure in the hillside, a dark opening perhaps 10 feet wide, which the children of the town called the Wound. No one went near it by preference. This was not charity. A cold knot formed behind Solveig's sternum as the understanding completed itself. This was an eviction notice written in the language of generosity, a death sentence delivered with the vocabulary of Christian decency. They were being given a place to die at a comfortable distance from the town's conscience. Sigrid coughed. The sound was dry and long, and it did not stop when it should have. It went on for a full 10 seconds, while the 5 men behind the table looked at their papers. One of them, a heavy man named Pruitt, folded his hands and looked at the ceiling. The cough finished. Sigrid took a breath. It was a shallow breath. It was the breath a person takes when a deeper breath is not available. "We understand," she said. Her English still carried the rhythm of the Norwegian she had spoken until she was 22. A gentle displacement of vowels that made shopkeepers repeat themselves and children stare. Her husband had been the buffer between her accent and the town's impatience. Anders Halvorsen, second generation, born on a Wisconsin farm to Norwegian parents, had possessed the American vowels his wife lacked. He had also possessed a quiet authority the men of Rustcreek Hollow respected in spite of themselves. Then a shaft had collapsed, and the authority was gone, and what remained was a woman with an accent and a daughter with no father, and no proof of a father, and no place now to keep the memory of one. Solveig stepped forward. The movement was barely perceptible, a shift in the gravity of the room rather than a stride. But it changed something in the air. She reached across the space between them and took the deed from Kane's outstretched hand. His fingers were soft. Hers were not. "We thank you," she said. Her voice was clear and level. She did not say it warmly. She did not say it coldly. She said it the way a woman lays a stone. Flat, level, load-bearing. She turned. She placed her hand at her mother's elbow. She walked her mother toward the door. Behind her, one of the men made a small sound that might have been a cough, and might have been a laugh. She did not turn. In the back corner of the hall on the last bench, where the light was thinnest, sat a man no one had thought to notice. Tobias Fenn was 65 years old, retired from the mines, when his knees had ended their argument with the work, living alone at the edge of town in a cabin that smelled of pipe smoke and the particular silence of a man who had outlasted most of what he cared about. He was a fixture at town meetings the way certain pieces of furniture become fixtures. Present so long, so consistently, that people ceased to register him as an object with any interior life. They assumed he was sleeping. They assumed he was drunk. They assumed he was irrelevant, which was the most useful assumption he had ever generated. When Cain had said the words Cold Anvil, Tobias Fenn had opened his eyes, just for a moment, just long enough for a quick, sharp examination of the room, that found Solveig, with the precision of a man, who had spent 40 years reading faces by lamplight in narrow spaces. Then his eyes had closed again, and he was furniture once more. Solveig passed within 3 feet of his bench on her way to the door. She did not see him. She heard him, because Tobias Fenn, who had not spoken at a town meeting in 5 years, said 5 words, at a volume calibrated for her ears, and no others. Your father knew that place. She stopped. Her hand was on the door frame, the splintered pine rough against her palm. She turned. But the old man's hat was already down, over his face. His breathing was the slow rhythm of genuine sleep, or a very practiced imitation of it. By the time she turned fully, he was rising from the bench with the unhurried economy of a man, with nowhere particular to be, shuffling toward the back door. His silhouette framed for a moment against the gray rectangle of the afternoon. Then he was gone. She stood with a deed in one hand, and a question she could not yet form in the other. Her mother tugged her arm. Solveig. Yes. They walked out into the afternoon cold. The wind hit them as soon as the door closed. November wind in Dakota. Not cold in the way that cold would become. Cold with intent. A metallic presence at the back of the throat, patient, watching the way a predator watches, from timber before deciding the moment has arrived. On the porch of the general store across the street, a young man was leaning against a post, with his arms crossed. He had positioned himself with the deliberate casualness of someone who had been waiting for the door to open and did not wish to appear to have been waiting for the door to open. Corbin Marsh, 19, tall without being broad, face almost handsome in the way of something not quite finished, eyes that had a calculating quality he mistook for intelligence. He pushed off the post as they came down the steps. Solveig. He used her first name. He said it softly. He said it the way a man says a name he wants a girl to hear said. She kept walking. Solveig, hold on. Sigrid slowed. Solveig did not. He caught up. I heard about the board. Did you? My father has a room. Behind the store. Nothing grand. Dry. Warm. You could work the counter a few hours. Against the cost. No. You didn't even. No. Her voice was still level. She had not looked at him. He stepped in front of her. Solveig, it's November. I know what month it is, Corbin. You'll freeze. Maybe. Your mother. Don't. The word came out flat and heavy, not raised, just laid down between them like a bar of iron. He blinked, because Corbin Marsh had spent enough evenings on porches, with enough girls to have a functional vocabulary for the moment, when a girl softened. And he had spent no evenings at all in the vocabulary of a girl, who did not. He stepped back. He tried a smile. The smile was a mistake. Pride doesn't keep you warm. She looked at him then. For the first time in the whole exchange, she looked at him. Whatever he saw in her face made his smile finish itself and die. When you can't take it anymore, he said, softer now. The store is always open. She did not answer. She walked around him. Her mother's hand found her elbow, and stayed there all the way to the end of the street. The road out of town climbed, through the last stand of lodgepole pine, before opening onto the exposed country above. The light was already low. The shadows of the pines lay across the road in bars of purple and gray. Sigrid coughed twice on the climb. She did not speak. Neither did Solveig. The silence between them was the kind that does not need filling, because both people inside it are holding the same weight. At the cabin door, Sigrid stopped. She turned and looked back down at the town. Rustcreek Hollow at dusk in November was a picture of prosperity in the process of composing itself. Lantern light in the windows, smoke rising straight up in the still air, the new lumber mill with its fresh white paint, the assayer's office, the general store, a town editing out the elements that disrupted the composition. Sigrid put a hand on her daughter's arm. He is not sending us to that place because he is generous. I know. He is sending us there because he thinks we will die. I know. A pause. Then, so do not die, Solveig. Solveig looked at her mother. Sigrid Halvorsen at 45 had been beautiful in a way that hard years had not erased so much as deepened. The way certain kinds of wood become more interesting as they weather. Her eyes were the pale blue of a lake in October. They were looking at her daughter with a directness that was not comfort. It was command. I will not. Sigrid nodded once. They went inside. That night, Solveig could not sleep. She lay on her cot in the loft above the stove. She listened to her mother's breathing. She counted the intervals. She had been counting the intervals for 2 years. They were shorter than they had been in the summer, longer than they would be in January. There was arithmetic in it. She hated the arithmetic. She could not stop doing it. At some hour that did not have a name, she climbed down the ladder. She lit a candle. She went to the small trunk under the window, the trunk that held what her father had left. Not much. A man dies unexpectedly, and what he leaves behind is the shape of interruption more than the shape of a life. A pipe, a pair of steel-toed boots, a knife, a packet of letters from his mother in Wisconsin, none of them opened after 1884, and a journal. Solveig had read the journal before, twice. The first time she had been 15, and her father had been alive. He had handed it to her one evening at the table and said, in his particular English, "You should look at this, if ever you want to know what your father thinks about." She had opened it. She had been baffled. Diagrams of tunnels, notes on the weight of air, numbers in columns, words she did not know. She had handed it back. He had smiled. He had said, "Someday." The second time she had read it had been the week after the collapse. She had opened it looking for something. A message, a last word, anything. She had found only diagrams and numbers and a handwriting that made her chest hurt. So badly she had closed the book, after 10 pages, and not opened it again. Tonight she opened it again. She did not know why, except she did. Except Tobias Fenn had said 5 words in a town meeting. And those 5 words had been walking around in her head all afternoon like a person she could not place. Your father knew that place. She held the candle over the pages. Diagrams, numbers, notes on rock, notes on air. She turned a page, and another, and another. Then she stopped. She was looking at a drawing. The drawing was of a horizontal passage cut into a hillside. Tunnel, not a mine tunnel. There were no mine tunnel notations, no or samples, no shoring diagrams for the roof. There was a firebox at one end. There was a chimney at the other. Between them, a long line ran under the floor of the passage. The line was labeled, "Stone flue, 2-degree grade, 50 feet minimum." Above the drawing, in her father's angular precise handwriting, 3 words. Home, not house. She turned the page. More drawings. A wall. A door. A window fitted into stone. A sketch of the entry to the fissure on Cold Anvil Ridge, with the exact proportions of the opening, and a note in the margin. The mouth is wider than a man remembers. It will take a full wall. For axe lengths of Douglas fir, chinked with clay and moss. She turned another page. She was reading now, not skimming, reading with the concentration of a woman whose life had just tilted onto a different axis without warning. Stone is a miser. It holds every degree it ever received. A fire at the mouth of a cave is waste. It heats the open air and gives the stone nothing to remember. A fire at depth with a long passage to travel teaches the smoke what it means to pay for what it takes. She turned another page. Sigrid's lungs cannot last another winter in the cabin. The stove throws heat for 6 feet, and then the room is cold again. The heat cannot be held, because the wood cannot hold it. Only stone can hold it. This is a fact of the earth. It is not opinion. A sound came out of Solveig that she did not intend to make. She turned another page. A list, materials, estimates, a calculation of days required for a single man, working alone, to excavate a 50-foot flue in glacial till. The number, 91 days. Beside the number, a note in a different color of ink. Faster if I can convince Tobias. She sat down on the floor. She had been standing. She sat down. The candle wax was pooling on the boards beside her. She did not notice, because her father, Anders Halvorsen, had not been a miner who kept an interesting journal. Her father had been designing something. He had been designing a way to live inside the earth. He had been designing it because he knew what the mine dust was doing to his lungs, because he knew what the winters were doing to his wife's lungs. He had sat down with his engineer's mind and asked what the earth could offer that the surface could not. 4 years ago, he had started this 4 years ago. The wound on Cold Anvil Ridge had not been a place her father knew. It had been a place her father had chosen, and the men who had given her that ridge today, believing they were burying her, those men had handed her the last piece of a puzzle her father had been assembling before they took him. She sat on the cabin floor in the middle of the night, with candle wax cooling on the boards. She pressed her palm flat against a page of her father's handwriting. She held it there until her hand stopped shaking. She whispered something. The room did not hear it. The stone under the cabin floor, patient as stone always is, may have. She walked to Dr. Cordelia Ashby's office the following afternoon. Ashby had taken over the practice the year before, when old Pierce had retired to Cheyenne. She was 60, lean, precise. She wore her spectacles at the very end of her nose, as though they were perpetually considering departure. She was not a warm woman. She was an honest one, which on the Dakota frontier was a considerably more useful quality. She had examined Sigrid the previous week. She spoke to Solveig on the porch. Voice low, manner clinical. Your mother's lungs are badly compromised. Yes, the tissue is scarred. From years of exposure to fine particulate in close quarters. From the mine dust your father carried home on his clothes. From the smoke of a cabin stove that never fully vented. I know. If she spends the winter in cold conditions, or in a space with poor air quality, she will not see February. Solveig gripped the porch railing. That is not a prediction, Miss Halvorsen. It is a medical certainty. What does she need? Warm air, dry air, clean air, consistently, not warm for an hour and cold for 3, consistently warm. Solveig nodded. Ashby watched her nod. Then Ashby did something she rarely did. She removed her spectacles. She pressed the bridge of her nose. I don't know what you intend on that hillside, she said. But those are the requirements. If you can meet them, bring her to me. I will find space. She started to turn. She stopped. She turned back. Your father came to see me. Once. 2, perhaps 3 years before the accident. Solveig's chest went still. He wanted to know whether a person could live in a subterranean space without respiratory damage, whether proper ventilation could make underground air cleaner than surface air, cleaner than a cabin full of cooking smoke and animal matter. He had very specific questions about air exchange rates, and humidity, and the movement of heat through stone. She looked at Solveig over the top of her folded spectacles. I believe he found his answers. She paused. The accident came before he could use them. She went inside. The door closed behind her. Solveig stood on the porch in the thinning light. She felt the weight of a new understanding settle over her the way a heavy coat settles across the shoulders when it is put on for the first time in a season. A weight that would be born. That was already being born. That was in some way welcome. Her father had not been improvising. He had been designing. She was going to build what he had designed. She told her mother that night. She told her all of it. the trench, the firebox, the stone-lined flue, the 50 feet of thermal mass that would turn the cave floor into a radiating surface. She told it clearly, without apology, the way her father had explained geological formations, as fact, as physics, as the logical conclusion of the available evidence. Sigrid listened without interrupting. She sat in the chair by the stove, her shawl pulled tight, the candlelight making deep shadows of the lines in her face. When Solveig finished, Sigrid did not speak. The silence was not the silence of a woman considering what she had heard. It was the silence of a woman confronting the fear that lived inside the words. Solveig, yes. You are talking like your father. Solveig said nothing. And your father died in a mine. The words arrived like something dropped from a height. Solveig absorbed them. She steadied. She continued. This is not a mine. It is a hole in the ground. It is a home. He was building a home. He was building it in his head, Solveig. He never built it. He never even started. He started it in this book. A book is not a wall. Sigrid's voice rose on the last word. The rising brought a cough. The cough went on. A full minute passed in the helpless sound of it, before Sigrid could speak again. Her eyes were wet. Her hand was pressed to her chest, as though holding something in. I would rather die, she said, with people around me, than alone in a cave. You will not die. Your father made me promises too. The air between them held those words for a long time. Neither of them spoke. The candle shifted in a draft. Then Sigrid did something Solveig did not expect. She reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. She held it. Give me until the middle of November, she said. If the cave is not livable by then, we go back to town. We accept whatever help is offered, in whatever form it takes. Solveig opened her mouth. She stopped, because she recognized what she was actually looking at. Not stubbornness, not fear in the ordinary sense. A mother looking at her daughter and asking whether the voice of the man she loved could still be trusted to keep the people he loved alive. This was not about engineering. This was about faith, and it deserved a response equal to what it asked. Middle of November, Solveig said. You promise me. I promise you. Sigrid squeezed her hand once. Then she let go. She went to bed. Solveig sat at the table until the candle went out. They left the cabin 3 days later. They loaded the handcart in the pale gray light of early morning. Bedrolls, the cooking pot, Sigrid's 2 dresses and Solveig's 1, the food stores in their sacks, the tools, the rock samples in their labeled paper wrappers, Anders's journal. Anders's boots stayed by the door. Sigrid had not been able to move them for 8 months. She did not move them now. Some things are meant to stay where they were put. Sigrid paused in the doorway. She looked back once. She did not look back a second time. Solveig was already calculating the angle of the first cut of the trench. They passed the general store. Corbin Marsh stood on the porch. He did not call out this time. He simply watched, arms folded, face arranged into what he believed was sympathetic concern, but was in fact the expression of a young man waiting to be confirmed in his prediction. Sigrid's grip tightened on Solveig's arm. The road climbed. The town fell away behind them. The path to Cold Anvil Ridge wound through the last of the timber and emerged onto the exposed slope. And the landscape did what such landscapes do to the eye of a person seeing them for the first time as home. It confirmed every fear the person had brought to it. The ground was a carpet of sharp, loose rock that shifted under their boots. The wind was constant, purposeful. It had traveled a long way to reach this ridge. It intended to travel farther. The mouth of the cave waited at the top of the slope. A dark slit in a wall of pale granite, 10 feet wide, 7 feet high at its tallest point. Thorny bramble clawing at the entrance, as though trying to hold the darkness inside, where it belonged. Solveig set down the handcart. She stopped, because something had changed. Something had changed since her scouting walk the week before. On the flat rock in front of the cave entrance, arranged with a neatness that had not been there, sat a set of mining tools, a spare pickaxe, a short-handled shovel, an iron chisel for splitting stone. They were old tools, worn smooth through decades of use. But the edges were clean, the metal recently oiled, the wooden handles rubbed, with something that smelled faintly of lard and pipe smoke. Beside the tools, on the surface of the rock, someone had drawn, in white chalk, an arrow, pointing into the cave. Beside the arrow, a number, 2 degrees. Solveig knelt. She picked up the pickaxe. She turned it in her hands. She examined the handle. The handle bore a specific wear pattern, a way of holding and working the grip over years that was distinctive as a signature, the kind of mark a particular technique leaves on its tool over time. She had seen it once before, on her father's tools, the tools he had maintained with the same care he gave his boots. It was a Norwegian miner's method, a grip her grandmother's people had brought across the Atlantic and passed hand to hand down through generations of men who worked stone in narrow places. Someone who had worked beside Anders Halvorsen. Someone who had understood what she was doing here before she had explained it to anyone. The number remained unexplained. 2 degrees. She filed it in the back of her mind, the way her father had taught her to file information that did not yet have a context. Not discarded, not pressed, simply held. A piece whose puzzle had not yet shown itself. Behind her, Sigrid had already begun to hum, a melody without a particular beginning or end. Something that moved the way water moves, circular, self-sustaining. She hummed it as she unpacked the handcart, as she carried the bedrolls through the cave entrance, as she arranged the food stores against the stone wall, with the same careful order she had maintained in the cabin. Some women pray. Sigrid organized. The impulse was the same, a refusal to allow surrounding chaos any purchase on the interior life. Solveig stood at the mouth of the cave. She held her father's pickaxe in one hand. She held the stranger's pickaxe in the other. 2 pickaxes, one from her father, one from a man who had known her father. She looked out across the valley. The wind moved her hair. The town of Rustcreek Hollow lay below in the afternoon light, small, prosperous, certain of itself. The men who had signed the deed were down there, warm, convinced they had solved a problem. They had not solved a problem. They had loaned her a weapon. She turned. She stepped into the cave. The change was immediate. The wind stopped. The air inside was still, damp. It smelled of wet stone, and something older she could name. Deep time, the accumulation of centuries in an enclosed space. Light from the entrance fell away quickly. She waited for her eyes to adjust. She found a space that went back perhaps 30 feet, before narrowing into a crack too small for a person to enter. The floor was uneven, packed earth and fallen rock in roughly equal measure. She measured with her eye. She thought of the drawing in the journal. The 50-foot line under the floor, the firebox at one end, the chimney at the other, the 2-degree grade running the length of the passage. She placed the elements in her mind. She positioned the firebox 6 feet inside the entrance. She traced the flue line back into the throat of the cave and out through the west wall to where the chimney stack would rise. She looked at the packed earth of the floor, 50 feet, 3 feet wide, 2.5 feet deep, 91 days for a grown man working alone. She was 130 pounds. She was 18. She was a girl the town had decided was already dead. She had 6 weeks. She lifted the pickaxe. She adjusted her grip. She looked down at the floor of her home. She brought the pickaxe down. The impact traveled through the handle and into her arms and down her spine. A sharp, sustained vibration she felt in her back teeth. The head of the pick struck the packed earth with a dull thud. Sank perhaps 1/4 of an inch. Stopped. She pulled it free. She swung again. The earth accepted this second blow with the same lack of grace. Another 1/4 inch. Another jarring stop. She swung again, and again, and again. By the time she had opened a hole the size of her hand, 20 minutes had passed. She sat back on her heels, sweat on her forehead. In November, wind at the mouth of the cave, distant now, muffled by stone. Her mother humming somewhere behind her in the low light. She looked at the hole. 1 inch of depth, 50 feet of length to go, 2.5 feet of depth to go. 6 weeks. She heard her mother's voice for the first time since they had arrived. Solveig. Yes. Come and eat something. She set down the pickaxe. She stood. Her arms trembled. She walked back toward the entrance, toward the small fire her mother had started, with the last of the cabin kindling, toward the tin plate of bread and cheese that would be their supper. At the cave mouth she paused. She looked back into the darkness, where the first hole she had made in the floor of her own home waited to be widened. Somewhere down in the town below them, a bell rang. The evening bell. A blacksmith closing his shop. A shopkeeper turning his sign. A boy walking a horse to a warm stall. She thought of the men behind the long table. She thought of her father's handwriting on the page. Home, not house. She thought of the anonymous chalk on the anonymous rock. 2 degrees. She whispered, in the language her mother had spoken to her, when she was small, 3 words. Ikiena far. Not yet. Father. Ikiena. She walked to her mother. She sat down. She ate. Outside, the November wind was already beginning to change. In the mountains to the northwest, snow was falling. It would reach the valley in 3 days. Tonight, the arithmetic was small. 1 inch of depth, 50 feet to go. And a girl with her father's pickaxe in the corner of a cave that a town had thrown away, chewing bread carefully, because her jaw ached, because her arms ached, because every muscle in her body was going to hurt for the next 6 weeks in a way she had never asked a body to hurt. She looked at her mother across the small fire. Her mother looked back. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The work had started. The first week was a lesson in what the body can be asked to do, not can be trained to do, not can be conditioned to do, can be asked. Because Solveig Halvorsen had not been trained for this. She had been raised to fetch water, to knead bread, to mend a shirt, to help her mother with the wash. She had been raised to walk 2 miles to town for salt, and 2 miles back again with the salt on her hip. She had been raised strong the way a farm girl is raised strong, which is to say sufficient, for farm work, not for this. The pickaxe weighed 9 pounds. The pickaxe had been made for a man's grip. She adjusted the grip. She learned to hold it further down the handle. She learned to swing from the shoulder rather than the arm. She learned to let gravity do the work her weight could not. By the end of the 2nd day, her palms were blistered. By the end of the 3rd, the blisters had opened. She wrapped her hands with strips of cloth torn from a worn shirt. She kept working. There was no arithmetic in which she could stop working. The days were finite. The trench was long. By the end of the 4th day, the blisters were bleeding through the cloth. Sigrid saw. Sigrid did not comment. Sigrid boiled water in the tin pot on the small fire at the cave mouth, and cleaned the wounds each night, with the careful hands of a woman who had cleaned worse. She wrapped fresh cloth. She said nothing. Because there was nothing to say. Because saying would have made it something other than what it was, which was work, which was the only thing available. By the end of the 1st week, Solveig had opened a trench 2 feet wide, and 18 inches deep, and 4 feet long along the marked line down the center of the cave floor. 4 feet, out of 50. She sat on the flat rock at the cave mouth in the last of the afternoon light, and did the arithmetic she was not supposed to do. 4 feet in 7 days. 50 feet at that rate meant 87 days. She had 33 days until the middle of November. She was going to lose. She sat with it. Sigrid came out of the cave. Sigrid sat down beside her on the flat rock. Sigrid did not ask what the arithmetic said. Sigrid had done the arithmetic in her own head, in the specific manner of a woman who had spent her married life doing arithmetic quietly in kitchens, while men did it loudly in offices. Sigrid put her hand on her daughter's knee. "You are going too fast," she said. "I am going too slow. You are trying to do a man's work in a girl's body. I know what I am. Then go slower. I don't have. Solveig. The word was not raised. The word was placed. Level. Load-bearing. Solveig stopped. You are going to hurt yourself in a way you cannot come back from. And then who digs the trench? I. Nobody. Silence. The wind moved across the ridge. So slower, Sigrid said. And I help. You cannot. I have hands, Solveig. I have a back. I have less breath than I would like. But I have hands. She held them up. They were still beautiful hands. Long-fingered. Elegant. The hands of a woman who had played a small church organ in a Wisconsin town before she had been married. Now roughened by 2 years of stove work and cabin labor, but still recognizable as what they had been. Show me what needs doing that does not need lungs. Solveig looked at her mother. Something inside her that had been held very tight for a very long time loosened one turn. Only one. She could not afford more than one. But one was something. Clay, she said. Clay. For the joints. Between the flue stones. When we get to that part. Then I mix clay. You will need water from the creek. I have carried water since I was 6 years old, Solveig. The recipe is in the journal. 3 parts clay. 1 part fine sand. 1/4 part chopped straw. Water until it is what a woman knows it should be. Yes, I have made clay for chinking every winter of my life. This is not different. Solveig did not answer. She could not, because her mother had just, in the space of one small speech, done what her mother did, which was to take a problem that had been shaped as impossible and reshape it as ordinary. Not simpler, just ordinary. A problem a woman could put her hands on and address. Sigrid stood up. She brushed the seat of her dress. She went inside to find the clay pot. Solveig sat on the rock in the last of the light and did not move for a full minute, because if she had moved she would have wept. And she had not wept since March. Then she stood. She went back to the trench. By the end of the 2nd week they had a rhythm. Solveig broke ground. Solveig cleared the loose material. Solveig cut the deeper sections with the chisel where the pickaxe found stone. Sigrid selected the flat stones from the scree slope outside. Sigrid tested each one for weight and surface. Sigrid rejected any that would not sit flush against its neighbor. Sigrid mixed clay at the mouth of the cave in a wooden trough Solveig had built from cabin scrap, stirring the heavy slurry, with arms that trembled with the effort and did not stop. Sigrid also, Solveig noticed, had begun to keep notes, on a small pad of paper, in a pencil sharpened with the kitchen knife. Sigrid noted the depth reached each day, the number of stones prepared, the quantity of clay mixed, the wind direction at morning, the condition of the sky at evening, the exact place along the trench where the pickaxe had struck harder ground. Solveig watched her one afternoon and understood what she was seeing. She was seeing her father. Her father had kept exactly such notes in exactly such a pencil. The habit was not a coincidence. Her mother had learned it from her husband over 23 years of watching him keep them. And her mother had kept it inside, dormant, waiting for a purpose. The purpose had arrived. The purpose was this. On the 9th day they hit their first real trouble. The pickaxe struck stone. Not the fragmentary shattered stone of glacial till. Solid stone. A vein of granite running diagonally across the line of the trench. Perhaps 2 feet wide at its narrowest. Perhaps 6 feet at the widest reading Solveig could take by digging exploratory holes on either side. She looked at it. She looked at her arms. She looked back at the granite. She thought a word her mother would have washed her mouth out for using at 8 years old. Because the pickaxe was not going to break granite. The pickaxe was going to break itself trying. She sat on the edge of the trench. She read the journal. Section labeled, on encountered stone. Her father's handwriting. A miner's chisel, and a hammer and patience. The rock has a grain. Find the grain. Work along it. Do not fight the stone. She turned the page. The stones you remove will serve you. Do not discard. Set aside for the flue lining. What resists becomes what protects. She closed the journal. She got the chisel. She got the small sledge. She began to work the granite. Not against its grain. Along it. The first strike sent a chip flying that just missed her eye. She learned to turn her face. The second strike found a fault line she had not seen. A section the size of her palm broke free. She set it aside. The third strike. The fourth strike. The fifth strike. By the end of the day she had extracted 22 pounds of granite in pieces ranging from fist-sized to head-sized. Each piece cleaner than a piece struck from an unrelated stone would have been. Each piece already flat on one face because the grain had wanted it flat. She stacked them by the wall. She looked at the stack. Her father had been right. What resists becomes what protects. The granite would armor the chimney base. Would make the stack a thing no casual force could unmake. She did not know yet that she would need it to be so. On the 11th day, Rutherford Kane rode out to look. He did not come up to the cave. He stopped his bay gelding at the base of the ridge road, and sat in the saddle for a long time. Solveig saw him. She did not stop working. She widened the trench. She fitted a stone. She mixed clay from the trough her mother had prepared. She sealed a joint. She wiped her hands on her apron. She did all of this without looking at him. Kane sat in the saddle for perhaps 20 minutes. Then he turned his horse and rode back to town. That night at supper, Sigrid said, "He came to see whether you were dead yet." "Yes." "He was disappointed." "Yes." Sigrid smiled. It was a small smile. It did not reach her eyes. But it was the first smile Solveig had seen on her mother's face since March. Thaddeus Holcomb came on the 13th day. He came on foot beside a mule-drawn cart loaded with fresh-cut Douglas fir. Seasoned, close-grained, enough to frame a small lean-to. The lumber was expensive. It represented a considered gift. He was 52 years old. He had built nearly every structure of consequence in the valley. His hands were the size of dinner plates. His face was weather-lined the way a barn is weather-lined. He carried himself with the particular slow deliberateness of a man who has calculated every step he has taken for 4 decades and has not fallen once. Solveig was setting the final capstone on the first 15 feet of the flue when he arrived. She was covered in clay dust from crown to boot. When she straightened to face him, she moved with the measured economy of a body that had been pushed to a limit but had not yet reached it. He removed his hat. He spoke carefully. "Miss Halvorsen, Mr. Holcomb, I have brought lumber. I can see that. May I?" She gestured. He stepped closer. He looked at the trench. He looked at the stacked stone. He looked at the sealed section of flue. He looked at the granite pieces armoring the chimney footprint. He was silent for a full minute. Then he said, "This is not a house." "No." "What is it?" "A heart." He looked at her. He did not understand. She had not expected him to. She said, "The fire goes here," pointing. "The heat travels through the stone. The stone holds the heat. The floor becomes warm. The smoke leaves at the far end, at a chimney 50 feet, from the fire cool and spent." He looked at where she was pointing. He looked at the trench. He looked back at her. His face was arranging itself into an expression she had seen on the faces of many men in the last 2 weeks. The expression of a man who wishes to be kind, and who believes that kindness in this moment means telling her the truth, as he understands it. "Miss Halvorsen, yes, I have built structures in this valley for 20 years. I know what keeps a person warm in a Dakota winter. I know that too. There was a family in the next valley, the winter of 79. I have heard. You have not heard from me." She stopped. He held her eye. "A man, his wife, their daughter. She was 14. They tried what you are trying. They built a fire inside an enclosed cave space. By morning all 3 were dead." He paused. "I carried the bodies out myself." The words landed with a weight, because he was not saying them to threaten her. He was saying them because they had happened. because they lived in him. Because a man who had put his hands on the frozen shoulders of a 14-year-old girl in a smoke-filled cave in 1879 did not lightly stand by and watch another girl of similar age propose to do a similar thing 7 years later. Solveig did not dismiss it. She said, "Watch." She knelt at the firebox opening. She struck a match. She lit a small handful of dry juniper in the firebox. For 1 second, 2, 3, nothing. Then the draw engaged. A deep resonant pull. The sound of a large space taking a breath. And the smoke did not rise. It did not billow into the cave. It was pulled downward, into the throat of the flue, with a suction Holcomb could feel as a change in the air pressure against his face. The smoke disappeared, into the stone, as completely as if the earth had chosen to accept it. Holcomb watched. His mouth opened slightly. He closed it. He watched the smoke that was not there. He said after a long moment, "It is the wind. It is not the wind. There is a wind at the mouth of the cave. There always is on this ridge. There is a temperature differential between the air inside the flue and the air at the far chimney, creating a draw. 50 feet of horizontal passage gives that draw more pull than any vertical chimney you have ever built." He looked at her. He looked at her the way a man looks at an animal that has just done something he did not know animals could do. That is, he stopped, because he had been about to say poetry, and he had heard himself in time to know that poetry was not the word. "That is engineering," she said, softly, not as a correction, as a statement. He was silent. She waited. He put his hat back on his head. "I will leave the lumber," he said, "in case you change your mind. I will use it. For a lean-to? For a wall." He blinked. A wall. Across the mouth of the cave. Framed. Door. Window. Sealed against the wind. He looked at the mouth of the cave. He looked at the pile of Douglas fir on the cart. He looked back at her. "That is not enough lumber. It is if I use every inch of it." He was silent again. Then he said in a different voice, "I hope I am wrong about you, Miss Halvorsen. So do I. But I do not think I am." He touched the brim of his hat. He turned. He walked down the ridge road beside his mule. Sigrid came out of the cave. She had been listening from just inside the door. She had heard everything. She looked at the pile of Douglas fir on the cart. She looked at her daughter. "Perhaps," she said, "you should take the wood, as he offered, just in case." "I am taking the wood. For a lean-to. For a wall." Sigrid closed her eyes. When she opened them, something had resolved in her expression that was not confidence, and was not surrender. It was the third thing that lives between them. She nodded. She went back inside. The sound of her stirring clay resumed. Word travels fast in a town that has decided a story. By the time Thaddeus Holcomb reached the bottom of the ridge road and tied his mule outside the feed store, the shape of what had happened on Cold Anvil had already moved ahead of him. The master builder had gone up the hill with good lumber and good sense, and the Halvorsen girl had refused to build a proper lean-to, and had instead chosen to seal herself and her sick mother inside a cave with a fire. Rustcreek Hollow received the news with the satisfaction of a community that had made its judgment, and was now watching events arrange themselves in support of the judgment. The girl was going to get her mother killed. Somebody said it in the feed store within 10 minutes of Holcomb's return. Nobody argued. Solveig heard none of this, because Solveig was in the trench. Miriam Holcomb came to the creek on the 15th day. Solveig was filling the water bucket. Her shoulders ached. Her vision was slightly granular from the dust. She looked up and there was a woman on the far bank. She had not heard footsteps, which meant the woman had approached carefully. The woman held a small cloth bundle against her chest. She looked uncertain the way a person looks uncertain when they have made a decision and are still in the process of convincing themselves they made it. She was Thaddeus Holcomb's wife. Solveig had seen her in town. Round face, direct eyes, a face that made no attempt to conceal what it felt. which in Rustcreek Hollow was a disadvantage for a woman. She held out the bundle. For you. Please. Solveig set down the bucket. She crossed the creek on the stepping stones. She took the bundle. Wool yarn. A tin of lard. Half a loaf of bread still warm from that morning. My husband does not know I am here. I understand. He would be angry. I understand. He thinks what is happening on this ridge is dangerous. He is not the only one. He is not wrong. He is often not wrong. I know. The woman took a breath. She let it out. But I watch you, from my kitchen window, every day. Solveig said nothing. Working up there. Alone. I am not alone. My mother is with me. I know. She paused. I have never seen anyone work like that. She said it not as compliment, as report, the way a person notes weather. Then she was moving back through the trees. Quickly. A woman returning to the world of conventional expectations, before it noticed she had stepped outside them. Solveig stood on the bank with the bundle. Wool, lard, bread. Her first response was refusal, a reflex built over the last 8 months. Learning that help extended in this town generally came with a grip on the other end. Accepting it felt like removing a stone from the wall she had built around herself and her mother, creating an opening through which something unwanted could enter. But she thought of Sigrid, the cough, the threadbare shawl. That was her mother's only concession to the cold. She took the bundle back across the creek. She carried it up the ridge. She gave it to her mother without explanation. Sigrid held the wool. Sigrid held it against her cheek. Sigrid said very quietly, "Someone in this town remembers that we are people." She did not say anything else. Solveig went back to the trench. On the 18th day, Corbin Marsh came in the dark. Solveig did not know until morning. She was asleep inside the half-sealed cave, deep in the particular exhaustion of a body that had spent the equivalent of 2 full working days in a single waking period. Her mother slept beside her. Outside, the night was clear and very cold, the stars hard and precise in the dry air. He came with a bottle of whiskey that was more empty than full when he arrived. He came without a plan. He was driven by something he could not have articulated, and would not have recognized as articulation even if someone had tried to name it for him. The absence of need was eating at him. He had been telling himself for 2 weeks that she would come back, that the cold and the impossible work and the eventual failure would drive her back. And when she arrived, he would be there, useful, necessary. 2 weeks, and she had not come. What he stood over in the moonlight was the chimney stack. 3 feet of carefully assembled stone. 2 full days of work. He kicked it. The first kick was tentative. The second was harder. The third was an act of destruction, purposeful, complete. The stack came apart in a cascade of displaced stone and cracking clay. He stood in the wreckage, breathing hard. The whiskey bottle dangled from one hand. He did not feel better. He felt considerably worse. He sat on a rock near the ruin. He stayed there for a time he did not measure, his boot prints deep in the soft earth beside the rubble. The soles had a distinctive pattern, the tread of work boots sold in his father's store, the only such boots in the valley. He walked back to town before first light. Solveig found the destruction at dawn. She stood before it, her arms at her sides. The trembling that moved through her body was not from cold. She was not the kind of person whose anger expressed itself in sound. It expressed itself in stillness first, a stillness so complete that Sigrid, emerging from the cave behind her, stopped at the sight of her daughter's back and did not speak. Solveig looked at the boot prints. She looked at the broken bottle glinting in the early light. The shape of what had happened assembled itself without ambiguity. She turned. She picked up the pickaxe. She began clearing the rubble. Sigrid stood at the mouth of the cave. Sigrid said her daughter's name. Solveig did not look up. "I will go and speak to the sheriff." "No." "Solveig." No. The single word was final. It was not the finality of anger. It was the finality of decision. He must answer for this. He will. How? By carrying it. Sigrid looked at her daughter for a long moment. She did not fully understand. She understood enough. She went back inside. That afternoon, Solveig walked into Rustcreek Hollow. Down the main street, past the assayer's office, past the feed store, past the men who stopped their conversations to watch her pass, past the sheriff's office without pausing. She pushed open the door of the Marsh General Store. The bell above the door rang. Corbin was behind the counter, sorting nails into a wooden tray with the practiced speed of a young man who had done the same task so many times it required no thought. He looked up. He saw her. Something moved through his face in rapid sequence. Alarm. Then the fast calculation of a man running scenarios. Then a forced settling into an expression of careful neutrality that cost him visible effort to maintain. She walked to the counter. "I need wire," she said. "And hinges." He stared at her. "Wire," she repeated. 20 feet, 14 gauge, and 2-door hinges. Iron. Heavy weight. He did not move. "I can pay with labor. A day in your stockroom. Whenever you need it." He found his voice. "Solveig." "The wire, Mr. Marsh." The wire." He went to the back. He came back with a coil of wire and 2 hinges. He set them on the counter. He watched her fingers pick them up. He said, and the words came out with an edge he had not planned, "I thought you did not need anyone." She looked at him. She looked at him for the first time since she had walked into the store. Her eyes were level. There was no heat in them. There was no anger. There was nothing personal at all. "I do not need anyone," she said. "I am buying supplies and offering fair labor. There is a difference." The distinction arrived in her voice without heat, which was worse than the anger he had prepared himself to receive, which meant she had already categorized what he had done and what he was, and had decided the category did not warrant the expenditure of her rage. He said more softly, "When will you come? To work?" "When you send word." She turned. She walked out. The bell rang. He stood behind the counter with the ledger open in front of him and looked at nothing for a long time. She rebuilt the chimney stack in 2 days. This time she sank the foundation stones below grade. She built the stack itself of the granite pieces she had extracted from the diagonal vein 2 weeks earlier, heavy enough that dislodging them would require tools and intent rather than whiskey and boots. She capped it with flat sandstone. She stood back and looked at it. The work was better than the first version, more stable, better integrated with the surrounding ground. She had learned something from the destruction. She had learned to build a thing knowing it would be attacked, which was a different way to build. She went back to the trench. 30 feet of sealed flue, 20 feet to go. 19 days until Sigrid's deadline. The crisis arrived 12 days before the deadline. In the form of water. Solveig was excavating the 45th foot when the pickaxe broke through into a pocket of saturated gravel. The water came without drama, without the theatrical violence of a flood. It simply appeared, seeping upward through the disturbed material, with the patient insistence of a thing that has been waiting for the disruption that would allow it to move. Within an hour, 2 inches of groundwater stood in the bottom of the trench. She stood in it. The cold came through her boots in minutes. The water was not deep. It was enough, because if water collected in the flue, the hot gases from the fire would convert it to steam rather than surrendering their heat to the stone. The thermal transfer, the entire mechanism on which the system depended, would fail. Every inch of the 42 feet she had already completed. Every shaped stone and sealed joint and carefully graded surface would be rendered into an elaborate exercise in wasted labor. She sat down in the trench, the cold water against her calves. She felt for the first time in 6 weeks the architecture of her determination begin to crack from below. She had calculated for rock. She had recalculated for granite. She had not calculated for this, because the earth had held a fact from her. Because the earth had no obligation to disclose it. Because that was the nature of the earth. Her father had known this better than anyone. He had gone into the ground every day knowing it held secrets that revealed themselves on their own schedule. Not his. She sat in the cold water and understood, with a clarity she did not want, that the deadline was going to arrive with the water in the trench. And Sigrid was going to look at the water and look at Solveig. And she was going to have to keep her promise. And they were going to walk down to town and knock on Corbin Marsh's father's door. She sat. The cold reached her knees. Sigrid appeared at the edge of the trench above her. Sigrid looked at the water. Sigrid looked at her daughter's face. The silence between them was weighted differently than other silences had been. This one contained the middle of November on one side, and the physical fact of the water on the other. Sigrid did not speak. She sat down, on the edge of the trench, her feet dangling over. She put her hand on top of her daughter's head. She left it there, for a long time. Neither of them moved. Finally Solveig said, "There is nothing in the journal about water." "You are sure?" "I have read it 4 times. Read it a 5th. "Mother, read it a 5th. Solveig climbed out of the trench. She dried her hands on her apron. She went to the corner of the cave where the journal was kept, on a flat stone, wrapped in oilcloth, as her father's most important things had always been wrapped in oilcloth. She unwrapped it. She sat by the mouth of the cave in the last of the afternoon light. She turned the pages slowly. The diagrams she knew, the calculations she knew, the notes on ventilation, the notes on stone properties, the list of materials. She was looking for something she had missed. She found nothing. She turned to the back of the book. The back pages of the journal were pages she had passed over on previous readings, because they were less organized, because the handwriting was more compressed, because they seemed to be working notes rather than finished plans. She turned a page. She turned another. She stopped. She was looking at a page whose top half was legible, and whose bottom half was smeared. Water damaged, perhaps. The ink had run at some point in the journal's history. Words that had been written there were no longer readable as words. They were only ghosts of words. She held the page up to the light. She turned it toward the mouth of the cave, where the westering sun was raking across the ridge at a shallow angle. She held the page at that angle, and in that oblique illumination, something became visible. The compression of her father's pen against the paper. The physical impression the writing had left, even where the ink had run and taken the visible letters with it. The paper itself remembered the shape of what had been written, in relief, like a message pressed from behind. She held her breath. She tilted the page. The words resolved. Slowly, one phrase at a time. Grade the floor. 2 degrees. Water follows gravity. Not hope. She sat down on the floor of the cave. Her legs gave out. She sat down. 2 degrees. The number that had sat in the back of her mind for 6 weeks, with no picture attached to it. The number that had been drawn in white chalk on the flat rock outside the cave on the morning they arrived. The number that the anonymous benefactor, with the Norwegian miner's grip on his pickaxe, had known she was going to need, because he had read the journal, or he had heard her father speak of it, or he had done both, and he had known she would encounter the water problem at approximately this point in the work, because Anders Halvorsen had encountered it in the mines, had solved it, had written the solution in this journal, had shared the solution with someone, and that someone was still alive, and that someone had been trying, in the only way he had available to him, to teach her the solution before she needed it. 2 degrees of downward slope, along the full length of the flue, running from the firebox toward the chimney end. Barely perceptible to the eye, more than sufficient for gravity to do what pumps and prayers could not. A slight pitch maintained along the full 50 feet. A narrow drainage channel cut along one side of the trench, and any water that seeped in would follow the grade to the low end and exit through the channel rather than pooling. She would have to reopen the sealed sections. She would have to relay every stone. She would have to lose 2 days. She did not have 2 days. She had 11. She stood up. She walked to the trench. She looked at the water. She looked at the sealed section behind her. She turned back toward the cave mouth. Sigrid was watching her from the entrance. 2 degrees, Solveig said. What? He solved it. He knew about the water. He wrote it down. I could not read it before because the ink had run. I can read it now because the light is right. Sigrid stared at her. He solved it. He solved it. Sigrid put a hand against the frame of the makeshift door. She steadied herself. How long? To reopen, regrade, reseal, cut the drainage. 2 days if I do not sleep. 3 if I do. You will sleep. Mother. You will sleep. Solveig looked at her. Sigrid held her eye. Because you cannot lay stone with hands that are shaking. And your hands will shake if you do not sleep. And a stone laid wrong is a stone that will have to come out again, which will cost you 4 days instead of 3. So you will sleep, Solveig. I promise you the trench will still be here in the morning. Solveig laughed. It was the first laugh either of them had heard from her in 8 months. It was a rough thing, half-formed, but it was a laugh. She wiped her face. All right, but I start at first light. Yes, do not let me sleep past first light. I will not. She worked for the next 3 days with a methodical anger. Not anger at the problem. Not anger at the water. The particular anger of a woman who respects the discipline of a thing, and who is being forced to undo and redo what she has already done correctly. In every way except the way she did not know to do it correctly. She relayed the stones with the 2-degree grade maintained throughout. She cut the drainage channel as a continuous feature along the eastern wall of the trench. She repacked the clay. She resealed the joints. She tested the drainage with water from the creek, poured deliberately into the high end of the flue, watching it find the low end and exit through the channel exactly as the physics required. The water drained. She sat in the trench for a long time without moving. The exhaustion was structural now, not surface, the kind that reaches into the mechanism itself and affects its operation. Her hands functioned. Her mind functioned. The efficiency of both had degraded. She climbed out of the trench as the sun went below the ridgeline. The temperature dropped sharply. The sky to the west was a hard pale orange fading into blue. The particular cold beauty of a high-altitude evening that offers nothing except itself. Sigrid was not in the cave. Solveig found her mother sitting on the flat rock, where the tools had first appeared, wrapped in her shawl, looking out over the valley below. The lights of Rustcreek Hollow were beginning to show in the early dark. Small warm points scattered through the valley floor like embers. Solveig sat down beside her. She did not speak. The silence lasted long enough for the first stars to become visible in the east. Then Sigrid said, quietly, without preface, I want to tell you something. Yes, I have been carrying it for a long time. Tell me. Sigrid was silent for another moment. Then she began. Your father knew he was dying. 4 years before the accident. Solveig held very still. He came home one evening. He sat down at the table. He said, Sigrid, my lungs are going. He said, I have 3 years, maybe 5. He said, I am going to spend that time building us a house that will not cough my wife to death after I am gone. She paused. I did not believe him. She paused again. I did not want to believe him. Her voice was steady, in the way a voice is steady when it has been rehearsed alone for a long time and has finally found a listener. He drew me pictures. He described a flue that ran under a floor, a chimney at a distance, a wall sealed against weather, a window that would bring light without bringing cold. I did not understand the drawings. I understood the look on his face while he made them, which was the look he wore when he had found a formation that confirmed a theory, or solved a problem that had resisted solution. The look of a man who had looked at the world clearly and found it at that specific point intelligible. She turned toward her daughter. Her face in the starlight was very still. He was not building a house, Solveig. He was building a promise. He knew he was going. He knew what the winters were doing to me. He sat down with everything he knew about the earth, and he designed a way to outrun both. The mine took him before he could finish, before he could even really start. She looked at the trench visible through the cave mouth behind them. She looked at her daughter. But you kept it. Solveig could not speak. You kept his promise. Solveig covered her face with her hands. She sat that way for a long time. Sigrid did not move to comfort her. She sat beside her daughter with her shawl around her shoulders and looked out at the lights of the town that had put them here. And she let her daughter have the tears she had not been able to have for 8 months. When Solveig lowered her hands, Sigrid took one of them. She held it. She said, "He would be very proud of you. I know. He would be very proud of both of us." Solveig turned her face toward her mother. Yes, they sat in the cold until the moon rose over the ridge. Then they went inside. She lit the first fire on the 5th of December. Dry juniper for kindling, arranged with the care of a woman setting up a demonstration. She struck the match. The kindling caught. She held her breath for 3 seconds. Then the draw engaged. That deep resonant pull she had felt for the first time in front of Thaddeus Holcomb 6 weeks earlier. Only stronger now, with the full 50-foot passage doing its work. With the 2-degree grade allowing the gases to travel exactly as physics required. The smoke went down, and stayed down. The cave filled with no smoke at all. She fed the fire slowly. Small additions. Controlled. She had learned enough from Anders's journal to know that this first firing was not about generating heat. It was about charging the thermal mass. About teaching the stone what she was asking it to do. She fed the fire for 4 hours. Then she banked it. She lay down on her bedroll. Sigrid was already asleep across the cave. Her breathing was slow and even. Solveig watched the low glow from the firebox for a long time. At some hour that did not have a name, she rolled onto her stomach. She pressed her palm flat against the cave floor. 3 feet from the firebox. Warmth. Not imaginary. Not wishful. Actual warmth. Rising through the stone with the slow certainty of a thing that had been building in the earth below and had finally reached the surface. She moved her hand along the line of the buried flue. Further from the firebox. Testing the gradient. The warmth was consistent. Not equal. Not uniform, but present everywhere she reached. 50 feet of charged stone. Releasing stored energy upward into the room. In the way that stone and only stone could do. Not in a burst. Not in a wave. In the slow, steady radiation of a thing that had been given heat and was now, in its own time, giving it back. She pressed her forehead against the floor. She held it there for a long time. Then she looked at her mother. Sigrid was asleep. Her breathing was even and slow and uninterrupted. No cough. Not the suppressed rattle of a woman managing it. Not the periodic percussion that had structured their nights for 2 years. Nothing. The air in the cave was warm, and dry, and clean, and Sigrid Halvorsen's lungs were operating in it. Without effort. The sound of that undisturbed breathing was the quietest and most complete vindication Solveig had ever experienced. She lay on her back on the warm floor. She looked at the stone ceiling. She breathed. Outside, the Dakota wind moved across Cold Anvil Ridge and found no gap to enter. Somewhere down in the valley, in a town that had signed a deed believing it was signing a burial paper, lamps were going out one by one as families went to bed. Inside the cave, the fire was banked to coals. Inside the cave, a woman was breathing without struggle for the first time in 2 years. Inside the cave, a girl of 18 was lying on a warm stone floor and thinking about her father. She whispered to no one, in the language her mother had used when she was small. Tak, far. Thank you, father. Tak. The stone under her back was warm. It would be warm all night. It would be warm all winter. Because that was what stone did. That was the point. The first winter passed the way a promise passes, when it has been kept. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, quietly, day by day, the way most important things pass in the lives of women who have learned to measure their victories in small units. Sigrid Halvorsen stopped coughing by the end of December. Not entirely, not all at once, but the constant percussion that had structured every night of the last 2 years faded into occasional, then into rare, then, for stretches of 5 and 6 days at a time, into nothing at all. Her color came back, not the flush of a girl, the steady color of a woman, whose body was no longer at war with the air it was breathing. Her hands, which had been cold to the touch since her husband died, warmed. Her eyes lost the perpetual half-squint of a person managing pain. She began, in January, to sing while she worked. Solveig heard the first song from the trench end of the cave. She had been packing clay into a joint that had begun to weep a fine dust when the temperature outside dropped below 0. She heard her mother's voice come up from behind her, small, uncertain at first, then steadier, a hymn in Norwegian, one her mother had not sung since before the accident. Solveig sat back on her heels. She did not turn. She did not want her mother to see her face. She let the sound wash over her. She thought, this is what we built. Not the trench. Not the stone. She wiped her face on her sleeve. She went back to the clay. Dr. Cordelia Ashby came to see for herself on a Thursday morning in the second week of February. She had been asked to come by no one. She had come because she needed to see. Because a doctor who has told a patient she will not see February, and then hears in town that the patient is not only alive, but reportedly thriving, is a doctor who owes it to her own profession to investigate. She ducked through the low door frame. She stood upright inside the cave. She did not move for 2 full minutes. She touched the wall with the systematic attention of a woman conducting an examination. She crouched. She placed her palm flat against the floor. She moved it. She moved it again, mapping the heat gradient with a scientist's methodical interest. Then she examined Sigrid, listened to her chest, had her breathe, had her cough, folded her stethoscope. "Your lungs are healing," she said, addressing Sigrid with the directness of a woman for whom false modesty was a form of imprecision. "The air quality in this space is better than anything in the valley. It is better, in fact, than my own surgery." She put on her hat. She moved toward the door. She paused with the door frame at her shoulder. She turned. She looked at Solveig. "I owe you a correction, Miss Halvorsen. Ma'am, when we spoke in October, I told you your father had found his answers before the mine took him." "Yes." Ashby looked at her steadily over the top of her spectacles. "He did find them, but he did not stop finding them. What he built here, he built for exactly this purpose. Not as theory, not as speculation, as a specific plan for 2 specific people." She paused. "I hope you understand that." She did not add to it. She left. She had said what was true. She saw no value in ornamentation. Solveig closed the door behind her. She stood for a moment with her hand on the wood. Sigrid was at the table. Sigrid did not look up. Sigrid said in Norwegian, "He always knew what he was doing. Yes. Even at the end. Yes." Solveig went back to work. Winter released its grip in the 3rd week of March. Not gently, the way Dakota releases winter, in a series of false thaws punctuated by punishing returns. A morning of soft air followed by a night that split the stones of the water trough. Mud where the snow had been. New snow on the mud. Mud again. Solveig and Sigrid emerged from the cave on the 4th day of true warmth to find the world had gone on without them. The town below had rearranged itself. The mill had built a new outbuilding. The Marsh General Store had painted its sign. A new sign hung outside the assayer's office. Wendell Kane's name had been added below his uncle's. The Halvorsen cabin on company land had been demolished and replaced with a small clapboard house. Wendell lived there now. He had put curtains in the windows. The curtains were yellow. Solveig looked down at the yellow curtains from the ridge one afternoon in early April and felt nothing, which surprised her. She had expected to feel something. She had expected the sight of another person's curtains in the windows of her father's house to reach into her and turn something over. And it did not, because the house on company land was not her father's house. Because her father's house was the cave. Because her father had built the cave in his head 4 years before he died, and she had built it in the ground with her hands, and it was standing, and it was warm, and her mother's lungs were healing inside it, and no man's yellow curtains anywhere in the territory could touch that. She turned away. She walked back to the cave. She began that afternoon on the outbuilding. The outbuilding was Sigrid's idea. Sigrid had suggested it in February, casually, over supper, as though the thought had just occurred. We should have a room for visitors. For visitors. Yes, Mother. Who is visiting? Nobody, yet, but someone will. Why do you say that? Because you built a warm place in the middle of a cold valley, and a warm place in a cold valley draws people, whether they intend it or not. Solveig had not answered that night. She had thought about it for 2 weeks. Then she had begun to sketch. Not a house, a single room, attached to the cave along its western wall, framed with the last of the Douglas fir Thaddeus Holcomb had left in November. Fitted with a small second firebox that would feed into the same 50-foot flue system, drawing on the same principle. Insulated with moss and clay in the way she had learned to pack the first wall. 6 feet by 8. Just a room. She began building it in the second week of April. Sigrid mixed clay. Sigrid sang. Sigrid did not cough. Thaddeus Holcomb came to see the outbuilding in May. He did not come with an offer. He did not come with a warning. He came because his wife, Miriam, had told him he needed to see it. And Thaddeus Holcomb was a man who had learned in 29 years of marriage that when his wife told him he needed to see something, he needed to see it. He arrived on foot. He walked around the outbuilding slowly. He examined the joinery. He examined the wall seal. He crouched. He placed his hand on the outbuilding floor. He looked up sharply. He put his hand back down. He held it there. He stood up. He looked at Solveig. The floor is warm. Yes. You have run the flue through here. Yes. From the main firebox. From both. The outbuilding has its own. Smaller. Connects into the primary line at the 18-foot mark and shares the draw. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "May I ask a question?" "Yes." "How did you calculate the flue length for the primary system?" She told him. He asked another question. She answered. He asked another. They stood in the sun in front of her outbuilding on Cold Anvil Ridge for a full hour. He asked. She answered. He did not correct her. He did not challenge her. He asked as a man asks who has understood that he is in the presence of a body of knowledge he does not have and wishes to acquire. At the end of the hour he removed his hat. He said, "I have a request." "Yes. My wife's father is coming to live with us in June. He is 78. His lungs are not good. My house is warm, but it is not warm the way this is warm." He looked at the outbuilding. He looked back at her. "Would you show me how to build one of these?" She looked at him. She looked at the man who had told her, in November, that she was going to suffocate her mother. She said, "Yes." That was all she said. He put his hat back on. He nodded once. He walked down the ridge. She watched him go. She thought, my father would have liked him. She thought, he would have liked him even in November. She turned around. She went to find her mother. Corbin Marsh continued to leave things at the cave entrance. Through the spring. He never left them in daylight. He never left a note. Solveig would come out of the cave in the morning and find a small parcel on the flat rock. A coil of good wire. A tin of mortar. Packet of nails. Once, a set of iron door hardware finer than anything he sold at his father's store. She used every delivery. She never mentioned the deliveries to anyone. She never mentioned them in any form to Corbin. She did not need to, because some conversations are conducted entirely in objects. Because some apologies are not spoken but built. Because Corbin Marsh was doing, in his own inarticulate way, the only kind of penance a man like him could do, which was to spend, quietly over months, the small resources of a store clerk on the survival of a woman he had tried to break in an act of jealous stupidity in the dark 6 months earlier. She accepted the penance. She did not forgive him. Forgiveness is a specific act. It requires speech. It requires an offering met with a receipt. She simply accepted, which was not the same as forgiveness, which was, perhaps, the beginning of it. She helped Thaddeus Holcomb build his own warm hearth, over the course of 5 weeks in June and early July. He provided the frame. She provided the physics. They worked together in a way that surprised them both, because Thaddeus Holcomb was a man who had built alone for 20 years, who directed crews rather than partnered with them, who had opinions about joinery that were not open to negotiation, who had never in his adult life taken instruction from a woman on a matter of construction. And Solveig Halvorsen was a woman who had, until 8 months earlier, never told a man anything about construction. They found a rhythm, his frame, her flue, his wood, her stone. He asked. She answered. She asked. He answered. By the end of the 2nd week, he had begun to bring his son. Elias Holcomb was 6 years old. Sandy hair, serious eyes, a boy who was small for his age and had inherited, from his mother, a habit of watching before speaking. He watched Solveig for the whole first day. On the 2nd day, he came up to her at the edge of the work site, with a small object in his hand. A stone, red sandstone, palm-sized. He had found it in the pile she had been sorting for the Holcomb hearth. Miss Halvorsen. Yes, Elias. Is this a good one? She examined it. The stone was good, flat on 2 faces. Solid weight, clean grain. That is a very good one. Should I keep it? Or should you use it? She looked at him. He was serious. He held the stone up with both hands. She said, "You should keep it, and bring it back to me next time you visit. I will tell you what I would have built with it, and you will know something you did not know before." His face changed, the way a child's face changes when a grown person has taken him seriously for the first time. He nodded. He put the stone in his pocket. The completed Holcomb hearth was fired for the first time on the 23rd of July. Miriam Holcomb wept, not loudly, standing in her own kitchen, with her hand on the warm wall of her own home. Weeping the quiet way a woman weeps who has spent her adult life being cold in winter, and has just, for the first time, understood that she does not have to be cold in winter again. Her father, Nathaniel Bain, sat in a rocking chair beside the new hearth. He was 78 years old. He had come from Massachusetts to spend what he believed would be his last winter with his daughter. He put his hand on the warm floor. He did not weep. He said in the New England voice of a man who had spent his life measuring his words, "Well, that is a new thing." He would live to see 3 more winters. He would spend all of them in that chair. Word spread the way word spreads in frontier territories, not through announcement, through experience, through the accumulated small moments of visitors coming to the Holcomb house and standing in the kitchen and putting their hands on the wall and saying, "How?" The answer was always the same. The Halvorsen girl, the one on Cold Anvil Ridge. They call it a warm hearth. By September, 3 more families had built one. By November, 7. By the following spring, 16 homes across 3 counties would carry a version of the design. But that was ahead. In the summer of 1887, Solveig did not know any of it. She knew that Sigrid was healing. She knew that the outbuilding was warm. She knew that Thaddeus Holcomb stopped by every second Sunday to bring her mother a jar of Miriam's raspberry preserves, and to sit for an hour at their table and talk about nothing in particular. She knew that Corbin Marsh's deliveries had stopped being anonymous in June, when she had come out one morning to find him standing on the flat rock, with a load of milled cedar shingles for the outbuilding roof, and he had looked at her and said in a voice she had not heard from him before, "I brought these." And she had said, "Thank you, Corbin." And that had been the whole conversation. And it had been enough. She knew these things. She did not yet know about the storm. Nobody did. Rutherford Kane came to the ridge in early November of 1887. He came on foot, alone, which told Solveig, before he spoke a word, that the visit was different from the ones before. He did not stop at the base of the ridge. He climbed. He arrived at the cave mouth breathing hard, and did not attempt to conceal it. He was 58 years old. He had ridden more in the last 20 years than he had walked, and his lungs and legs were paying the interest on that arithmetic. Solveig was in the outbuilding when he arrived. She came out. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at him. He looked at her. He said, "Miss Halvorsen." He said it the way he had said her mother's first name in the council chamber, which is to say without warmth, but with, now, an inflection that had not been present a year earlier. The inflection of a man who had come to say something he did not want to say. "Mr. Kane, I would like to speak with you." "Speak." He glanced at the door of the outbuilding. "May I sit?" She hesitated. Then she said, "Yes." She led him inside. He looked around. She watched him look around. She watched him register the warm floor, the clean air, the window with its glass pane, the small stove venting into the shared flue, the neat order of a room built by a woman who intended to inhabit it for decades. He did not comment. He sat. He removed his hat. He held it in his hands. He said, "The board has commissioned a geological survey of the northern acreage of your parcel." Silence. "The results arrived last week." Silence. "The parcel contains a copper deposit of significant commercial value." She said nothing. He waited. He had expected her, perhaps, to react. She did not, because she had suspected it. Since June. Since she had begun to catalog the samples in her father's rock collection, and had understood, with a slow dawning clarity, why Anders Halvorsen had chosen this specific ridge for his hearth. Not by accident. By survey. He had known. He had known everything. Kane cleared his throat. "The deed you were given," he said, "in the ordinary course would have reserved mineral rights to the board. But it did not." He looked up sharply. "You knew." "I have read the deed, Mr. Kane." "When?" "In November. On the day it was given to me." He stared at her. "You knew that day." "I did not know about the copper. I knew about the deed." He processed this. He processed it slowly. She watched him process it, because she was watching a man understand, in real time, that a girl he had thought he was burying had walked out of his council chamber, with the whole future of his mining concern folded inside her closed fist, and he had not seen it. And had not seen it because he had not looked. And had not looked because it had not occurred to him that a Norwegian widow's daughter of 18 would read a deed, with the attention of a lawyer. He set his hat on the table. He set his hands flat on either side of the hat. He said, "The board is prepared to make an offer. For the mineral rights, or for the parcel in its entirety. Whichever you prefer." "No. You have not heard the number." "I do not need to hear the number. Miss Halvorsen, the offer will be substantial." "Mr. Kane." She sat forward. She placed her elbows on the table between them. She looked at him directly. "There is no number you can offer me that will move me from this ground. My father chose this ground. He chose it before you gave it to me. He chose it because it is what it is, which you did not know because you did not look, which is not my problem. It is now yours." He did not speak. She continued, "I will engage an attorney in Cheyenne. Dr. Ashby has recommended one. I will retain his services next week. I will develop the deposit myself. On my own terms, under my own name." He was very still. Then he said in a voice that had aged, "You are 18 years old. I am 19. Since October. You have no experience. I have my father's journals, and I have a lifetime of listening to him talk. And I have an attorney who does have experience. He looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. He picked up his hat. He put it on. He stood. At the door he paused. He turned. He said, and it cost him. Your father was the best man in my employ. I did not appreciate him. When he died, I did not attend his memorial. I regret that. She looked at him. She did not answer. There was nothing she could give him. There was nothing he was owed. He nodded once. He walked out. She watched him go down the ridge. She sat at the table for a long time after he was gone. Sigrid came in from the main cave. Sigrid looked at her daughter. Sigrid said, "Well." Solveig said, "Yes." Copper. "Yes." "You suspected." "Yes." "You did not tell me." "I was not sure." Sigrid sat down across from her. She reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. Your father would not want you to become a rich woman who forgets. I know. So do not forget. I will not. Sigrid squeezed her hand. She let go. She went back to the main cave. Solveig stayed at the table until the light in the window turned blue, and then black, and then it was time to light the lamp and start supper. The storm arrived on the 12th of January, 1888, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. In Rustcreek Hollow, the temperature stood at 43 degrees. Children had gone to school in wool coats, but not in mittens. Doors of shops stood open to the mild air. Wendell Kane, who had been reviewing sample assays in his office, had rolled up his sleeves. The change came from the northwest. Not gradually, instantaneously, a wall of darkness at the horizon, moving at the speed of a locomotive. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 5 minutes. Then 20 more. The wind arrived before the snow, a solid blow, that knocked a man off the porch of the general store and tore the shutters from 3 windows on the main street. The snow did not fall. It arrived horizontally, driven by a wind, so fast the individual flakes could not be distinguished. Only the mass of it, white and total, reducing visibility to the length of an arm and then to less. The sound was not a howl. It was a roar, a sustained roar, so vast and uniform that it ceased to function as a sound and became instead a new condition of existence. In the cave on Cold Anvil Ridge, the transition registered as a change in acoustic texture. The low muffled roar of a large system moving a great quantity of air at great speed, attenuated through hundreds of feet of rock and earth. Almost abstract, a vibration more than a sound. The candle flame did not move. The temperature did not change. The wall held. Solveig set down the harness leather she was mending. She listened. She said, "It has come." Sigrid, at the table, did not look up from her knitting. "Yes. It is bigger than the ones from last year." "Yes. How do you know?" Sigrid finally looked up. "I have listened to Dakota winters for 6 years, Solveig. This one is different. I have known it was coming for 3 days. You did not tell me." "There was nothing to tell. It would come or it would not. It has come. Now we listen for who else it has come for." She went back to her knitting. The needles clicked. Outside, the storm remade the world. They came in the second hour. Thaddeus Holcomb first. Alone. He arrived at the door of the cave with a coat frozen stiff and blood on his face, where the wind-driven ice had cut him. Solveig opened the door. The wave of cold that entered with him was violent. She closed the door behind him. He stood for a moment. He could not speak. She waited. Sigrid came from the table with a blanket. He found his voice. Miriam, and Elias, and Hazel, in the town, in the general store. They are at the store. They went for flour. 2 hours ago, when the sky was blue. The store is well built. It is not enough. He looked at her. The wind took the mill roof. It took the assayer office door. It will take the store. Come with me. She was already moving. She was pulling on her coat. She grabbed a coil of rope from the wall. Sigrid. Solveig. I am going. Yes, go. Watch the fire. Yes. Do not open the door for anyone, unless they name themselves. Yes. She went. The trip down the ridge in a blizzard is a story of its own. She and Holcomb roped themselves together. They descended by feel. They lost the road twice. They found it twice. Holcomb fell 4 times. She fell 6. They reached the town at 4 in the afternoon. The store was still standing. Inside were 14 people. Miriam Holcomb, the 2 Holcomb children, Corbin Marsh and his father Elmore, Josiah Kettler, a farmer, his wife Alice, their 3 sons, Dr. Cordelia Ashby, who had come to the store for coffee and had been unable to return to her surgery, a traveling salesman named Whitmore Pace, and, sitting quietly in the corner on a barrel, Tobias Fenn. Solveig looked at the room. She did not have time to register any of the individual faces. She said, "You are all coming with me." Elmore Marsh. "Where?" "To my house." "Your house?" "On the ridge." He stared at her. He said, "Girl, the ridge in this. The ridge is warmer than this store will be in 2 hours, when your fire is out. Which it will be, because I saw the woodpile as I came in. And it will not last the night." Nobody spoke. Then Dr. Ashby stood up. She said, "She is right. Get your coats." Ashby's word ended the argument. They roped themselves, all of them, the 3 children in the middle, Solveig at the front with Thaddeus, Ashby at the back. They walked out into the storm. The trip up took 4 hours. She would not remember most of it. She would remember the moment when little Elias Holcomb, 60 feet from the cave door, stopped walking. Just stopped, sat down in the snow, said, "I am tired." She would remember picking him up. She would remember his weight on her shoulder as she covered the last 60 feet. She would remember her mother opening the door. Her mother standing in the warm rectangle of light, in her clean apron, in the cave that had been built by a man who had loved her, and saying, in a voice that carried above the wind, one word, "Come." They came. 14 people through the door. Sigrid closed the door. The wind stopped. 14 people stood in the warm cave and looked at their hands, at each other, at the walls, at the floor. 14 people who had spent the last 3 hours in the certainty that they were going to die. Nobody spoke. Then Elias Holcomb, still on Solveig's shoulder, lifted his small head and said, to the whole room, "It is warm here." Somebody laughed. Somebody cried. Sigrid Halvorsen was already directing. Blankets, water, places on the floor, a pot of stew that had been simmering on the firebox all afternoon in what she had insisted was preparation for a possibility. Bread. The 3 children given the warmest corner. The oldest people given the second warmest. Dr. Ashby given a stool by the firebox, because she was already opening her bag to see who needed what. Little Hazel Holcomb pointed at the ceiling. She said, to no one in particular, "The bear cave has food." Everybody laughed then. Even Thaddeus, whose face was still crusted with frozen blood. Even Corbin Marsh, who was standing against the far wall with his eyes on the floor and a look on his face that Solveig would think about for the next 30 years. Even Tobias Fenn, who had walked in silently at the back of the line, who had sat down in a corner without asking anyone, whose eyes now were on Solveig, who lifted, when she looked at him, one hand and nodded once. The storm lasted 3 days. Nobody died in the cave. 2 died in the town below. 1 frozen in an outhouse. 1 who had left his cabin to look for a wandering horse and never returned. Later they would learn that across 4 territories more than 200 people had died. Many of them children who had left schoolhouses without coats. The storm would enter history as the schoolhouse blizzard. It would enter the memory of every survivor as the daytime broke. In the cave, 14 people slept in shifts on a warm floor. Ate stew and bread from Sigrid Halvorsen's careful stores. Told stories. Learned each other's names. Held each other's children. Watched the candle flame stand perfectly still while, outside, the world unmade itself. On the second night, Tobias Fenn crossed the cave and sat down beside Solveig by the firebox. She looked at him. He said, "It is time. Yes. I have carried this for 22 months. I know." He looked at his hands. They were an old man's hands. Splayed, weathered, missing a finger from an accident in 1867. He said, "Your father found the copper in the spring of 1885. She nodded. He went to Kane. He said, "There is a deposit under the northern acreage of the company hold. It will be commercially significant, but the ground above it is unstable. The shaft as currently planned will not hold. There will need to be new shoring, new surveys, a delay of perhaps 6 months." He paused. Kane did not want a delay of 6 months. Solveig held very still. Kane said the shoring was sufficient. Your father said it was not. Kane said your father was overcautious. Your father said the ground would go, if it was worked as planned. He looked at her. They worked it as planned. Silence. The ground went. Silence. Your father was in the shaft when it went. She nodded. She had known. Not the details. Not the specifics. But she had known. The way a daughter knows. Tobias said, "I was outside the shaft. I heard the timber. I saw the smoke. I was one of the men who tried to dig him out. We dug for 2 days. There was no reaching him." He was silent for a long time. He said, "Kane paid me to say the collapse was unforeseeable. He paid every man on the crew the same. Some took it and stayed. I took it and left. I have not spent 1 cent of what he gave me." He reached into his coat. He took out a small leather pouch. He set it on the floor between them. "This is that money. It is now yours." She did not touch it. She said, "Why did you not go to the sheriff? There is no sheriff for what happened. Your father died of a collapse. That is what the record says. 6 men on the crew would swear to it. Kane owns 4 of them. The other 2 have families. Then why did you come to the town meeting in November? Because I saw the letter delivered to your cabin. I knew what Kane was going to do. I knew what he was going to give you. I knew what your father had said about that ridge. And I remembered what your father had told me one night in the spring of 1885. He said, 'If anything happens to me, Tobias, watch out for the girl. She has the mind for it. She will figure the rest out on her own, if she is given even a small start. Just watch out for her.' That is all he asked. That was all I promised." He looked at her. His eyes were wet, not from grief, from 22 months of carrying a thing alone. "So I left you the tools. I wrote the number. I stayed away, because your father had said, 'She will figure the rest out on her own.' And you did. You did every part of it. I did nothing but leave you a pickaxe." She looked at the pouch on the floor between them. She looked at the old man. She said, "You watched out for me. I did what I could. You did what my father asked. I did what I promised." She reached across the floor. She took his hand. She held it. She said, in the language her mother spoke to her when she was small, "Tack. Thank you." Old Tobias Fenn wept in front of a fire in a cave on Cold Anvil Ridge, in the middle of the worst storm the Dakota Territory would see in a generation. Wept quietly, without shame. Wept for a man who had died in a mineshaft in 1886. Wept for a girl who was no longer a girl. Wept mostly because the promise was finally kept. Solveig sat with him until he was still. Then she picked up the pouch. She put it in her pocket. She did not open it that night. She would open it in the spring. She would use every dollar to build the schoolhouse. The storm broke on the morning of the 15th. The transition was not gradual. The roar stopped, silence so complete it felt pressurized. Solveig opened the door. The world outside was white in every direction. The temperature stood at 20 below zero. She stood in the doorway. She looked out over the valley. Rustcreek Hollow was still there. Diminished, battered, its familiar shapes altered by the drifts. But there, she thought of the 2 who had died. She thought of the 14 who had lived. She thought of her father. Behind her, in the cave, 14 people were beginning to stir. Someone was building up the fire. Somebody's child was asking for bread. Dr. Ashby was checking Elmore Marsh's cough. Sigrid came to stand behind her at the door. Sigrid put her hand on her daughter's shoulder. She said, "He would have been proud." "I know." He would have said, "Of course, Solveig. What did you expect?" Solveig laughed. It was a small, tired laugh. She turned and looked at her mother. She said, "Come inside, mother. It is cold." She closed the door. The wind did not enter. The copper mine opened in the summer of 1889. Under Solveig's name, managed by an engineer she hired from Denver, worked by a crew that included 6 men who had left Kane's employ the previous winter, when word of Fenn's testimony had spread through the valley in the specific way that stories about dead men and buried truths spread through frontier towns. Kane did not go to jail. There was not enough evidence. There would never be enough evidence. Tobias Fenn's word against 5 paid men was not the kind of case a territorial court took up. But Kane's business collapsed. Not dramatically, in the specific way that a business collapses when the community around it has quietly decided that its owner is a man they do not wish to do business with any longer. He left Rustcreek Hollow in the fall of 1890. He went to San Francisco. He was not heard from again. Solveig used the first profits from her copper to build a schoolhouse at the edge of town. A brick building, warm floors, a stone-lined flue system running under every room, a brass plate above the door engraved, with a single line, the Anders Halvorsen School. Miriam Holcomb taught in it for 22 years. Every child who attended it learned, in the first week of first grade, 3 things: how to read, how to identify the 6 most common rocks of the Dakota Territory, and how to build a fire that would not fill a room with smoke. They were considered, in the counties around, the best educated children on the plains. Tobias Fenn died in the cave in September of 1891. He had spent most of the last 3 years in a chair by the firebox that had, without any formal decision, become his chair. He drank tea. He watched. He spoke rarely. He was present the way certain old men are present, absorbing what the room was doing without needing to comment on it. He died on a Tuesday afternoon. The tea in his hand was still warm when Sigrid found him. Solveig buried him on the ridge above the cave. She set a piece of red sandstone into the earth above him. She did not carve his name. He had spent 68 years being a man who knew things without being asked how he knew them. It seemed right that what marked his presence in the earth should communicate in the same mode. Those who needed to know where he was would know. The stone was enough. Sigrid Halvorsen lived to be 78. She died in the winter of 1919. In the outbuilding Solveig had built for her in the spring of 1887. In the bed she had slept in for 32 years. Warm floor beneath her, clean air in her lungs, her daughter holding her hand. Her last words were in Norwegian, the melody she had sung to Elias Holcomb on the first night of the blizzard in 1888. Something circular, self-returning. A tune that did not require a last note, because it had no last note. Solveig held her mother's hand until it was cold. Then she went outside. The Dakota sky was black. The stars were very bright. She stood on the flat rock, where the tools had first appeared 33 years earlier. She said, aloud into the cold, "You built her a promise. I kept it as long as I could." The stars did not answer. The stone under her boots was warm. She went back inside. Solveig never married. She adopted 3 orphan children in 1893, 2 girls and a boy, from the county home in Pierre. She raised them in the cave and the outbuilding, and the small clapboard house she built beside them in 1895. She sent all 3 to college. 2 became teachers. 1 became a mining engineer who ran the copper concern after Solveig retired in 1928. She died in the spring of 1948. She was 79. She died in the cave, on a warm floor. Her granddaughter, Annika Halvorsen, the mining engineer's oldest child, named for a great-grandmother in Wisconsin she had never met, was with her. Annika was 12. Solveig held her granddaughter's hand. She said, in a voice that had grown quiet with age, "Do not fight the wind." "I won't. Be the mountain." "I won't fight it, grandmother." "Absorb the sun." "Yes." "Remember its warmth." "Yes." "Give it back." "I will." Solveig closed her eyes. She smiled. She did not open her eyes again. A traveler passed through Rustcreek Hollow in the summer of 1954. He was writing a book about frontier engineering. He had been directed to the town records. He read for 2 hours. He found, in the records, a leather-bound journal in angular precise handwriting. A dead man's record of the understanding he had accumulated. A design for a thing he had not lived to build. The traveler read the journal to its final page. On that page, in a different hand than the rest, a single sentence had been added. In pencil. Long ago. He builds the mountain in his head. She builds it in the ground. And the mountain warms the child. The traveler closed the journal. He sat in the warm records office. Stone warm floor beneath his feet. And he thought about the kind of woman who writes a sentence like that in a mining journal and does not sign her name. He stood. He walked outside into the bright Dakota afternoon. On the hillside to the north, barely visible against the pale rock face, a thin wisp of warmth rose from a small stone column, the chimney of a system that had been running with maintenance and occasional repair for 68 years. In the window of the door set into the rock face above it, a warm light held steady in the late afternoon shadow. Someone was home. The traveler stood for a long time watching the smoke. Then he walked back to his horse. He mounted. He rode east. He was thinking, as he rode, about a promise a man had made to his wife in a Wisconsin kitchen in 1882. About a hole in the ground. About a girl with a pickaxe. About stone. About what stone could do if you asked it